In his letter to Christians, the Apostle John defined what love for God is. In chapter 5, verse 3 of his letter, John wrote, "This is love for God, to obey his commands, and his commands are not burdensome." Christian parents, we are required by God to both develop our children and to disciple our children. In the previous 4 episodes, I have been attempting to persuade you that when it comes to discipling our children, we should train them about the basics of Christian living and how to do them well. And so far, we have learned from the Apostle John that the basics of Christian living involve believing that Jesus is the Christ and loving others for his sake. Now, John adds here another basic of Christian living, and that is obeying God's commands. Here, John would have in mind the commands that Christ has given. He himself heard from Jesus' own mouth that disciples of Christ are to be trained to obey all that Jesus has commanded. So, children need to be learning from us as parents what the commands are that Jesus requires of Christians, and they also need to see us as parents obeying those commands by the way we work them out in our daily lives. Consistently obeying is not always easy and requires us as parents to be abiding in the love of God, repenting when we deviate or breach his commands, and exercising constant self-control while walking with the Spirit. But there is an important approach to obedience that many of us neglect or ignore, and therefore we don't tend to teach our children the importance of this approach to obedience. Obedience is not only being consistent in doing what is commanded, but it's also just as importantly about being creative. I want to challenge you today to learn to creatively obey Christ and to teach your children to be creatively obedient. John says that God's commands are not burdensome, and that is because they are primarily about loving others, our fellow Christians and our fellow creatures. When you think about it, loving others, whether it be respecting them, caring for them, supporting them, or serving them, it's a wonderful, beautiful, and glorious way to live. It's a far better way to live. Compare it with the way of life that we had before, being selfish, uncaring, thoughtless, disrespectful, or maybe even abusive. It's a no-brainer as to which is the better and greater way to live and the way we're persuading our children to live. But to obey God's commands to love him and to love others is very broad. It's a very broad command with very little specific detail on what, when, and how we are to love and serve God and others. That's because we're to be creative. God's commands require us to be creative and to use our ingenuity. It requires us to get to know other people, understand their needs, their interests, their desires, and if they allow, even maybe their disappointments and fears or pain. It requires us to think hard about what we have in terms of our own personal resources or abilities or talents that we can use to minister to them and serve them in appropriate ways according to their context for their well-being. So when it comes to doing what Jesus commands, we need to be very creative and exercise initiative and our imagination, and to even learn from each other different ways we can use our abilities, our resources in the service of others to make the world a better place, both for them and for us. We do not want to raise kids to think that obedience is a dirty word or a negative thing that restricts what we can do. Sometimes it does require the setting of boundaries to restrict, but often obedience is ultimately about ministering God's best for the welfare of others in ways that we are uniquely gifted to do according to our opportunities and circumstances. And although we are talking about showing and telling our children about the way a Christian approaches obedience, we want them also through that to learn that obeying even us as parents and obeying our authority does not have to be a negative thing. It's an opportunity to do so much more with their talents, with what they've got, instead of just doing the bare minimum in a really reluctant way. So tell your kids to get rid of the attitude when it comes to obedience and obeying commands, and instead to think about it in this way, that it's an opportunity to do what is required and to excel and surpass what's requested. Help them to see that obedience is not about robbing them of their freedom, but it can be about training them to use their freedom in responsible, good and constructive ways that serve more than just their own needs, but go beyond to serve God and other people. When you do so, your children will be developing their abilities and talents in ways that will set them up for a bright and useful future, where they will have to work creatively and cooperatively under the guidance and direction of others. Teach them to be creative in their obedience.